Hello and welcome back to our cottage garden for our 2024 yearly recap video. We're so excited to make this video, have a look back at how things went this year, things that went well and things that didn't go so well. It's going to be really honest, it's going to be a bit messy, it's going to be exciting, so grab a cup of tea and get comfortable and hopefully you'll enjoy this long video with us. So if you're also a gardener, you might know that it's very easy to get swept away with looking at the things that we need to do and our plans for the future, and not so easy to sit back and appreciate just how hard we've worked over the year. So that's what this video is all about, and I would encourage you to do the same because it can make you feel really, really good about what you have actually achieved. Currently in the garden, things are looking really, really messy. We've recently had a storm that brought 90-mile-an-hour winds to the garden, and that is very, very strong indeed. We're lucky we got off lightly, but there is a lot of mess that we need to clear up. So I'm glad that we're not so much showing you around today and rather reflecting. But I think it is good to be honest in these videos because social media can paint a kind of unrealistic picture sometimes. Before we get into the video though, just wanted to say a huge thank you to those of you who have joined us on Patreon this year. Your names will be at the end of this video in the credits as usual, but just wanted to say a massive thank you, and your support on Patreon has funded many plants and flowers in the garden that we're going to be looking at today. Also a huge thank you to those of you who have been watching our videos regularly and subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. It makes a massive difference to us and means that we can keep making these videos, so thank you. Something that I'm really, really excited to share with you is that throughout the last year I've been working on a book and it's called Growing. It's now available for pre-order, so you can order it in all of the usual places, and it will be released on March the 6th. And this is the first time I've seen a copy of it, so I am so delighted to share this with you, and I hope that you really enjoy reading it. There are three kind of main themes that I wanted to convey in this book. The first was a practical theme, so for anyone who's new to gardening or wants to learn a little bit more, it's a seasonal walk through practical tips to get you started with gardening. There's a second theme that's really, really personal to me, and I wanted to share how gardens can give us a sense of peace and escape, especially while we're working through something difficult. So for me, I wrote about how the garden helped me come to terms with my autism diagnosis, which I received in my late 20s. That was quite difficult, but the garden gave me a space to really have a deep think about it, process those hard emotions and come to terms with things, and ultimately end up in a much better place for it. The last thing that I wanted to share in this book was just a sense of escapism and appreciation for nature. So my partner Aaron has done all the photography in this book, and I think it's absolutely stunning, but I hope it's the sort of book that you can just sit down, have a nice cup of tea and really get lost in some beautiful photos of plants and gardening. So if you would like to pre-order Growing, I will put the link in the video description. It's currently available in all of the usual UK retailers, and for those of you overseas, Waterstones delivers internationally too. I will keep you updated as I hear more about getting it released in different countries, but for now, the link is in the video description to pre-order. I thought I would start the yearly review in spring, so for us that is March, April and May. It feels like a more natural start to reflecting on the year when there's a lot of new growth and life around, and historically I think we did begin the new year in spring, so let's start with that. It was a time where both me, Aaron and the garden worked immensely hard, so there's quite a lot to reflect on. As usual, our crocus lawn flowered at the end of February, the start of March, so the very beginning of spring. We've got thousands of bulbs now that are naturalised in the grass, and I must admit it wasn't the best of years for the crocus lawn, but we did have some beautiful flowers, and one of the things we enjoyed the most this year was watching the bees. We spotted quite a few that would curl up among the petals of the crocuses and take a nap in between foraging, so that was really, really lovely. The crocuses that we grow the most of are a variety called Pickwick, which are a large purple flower flower, and they've naturalised quite well in the garden, but some years are better than others. I think they've been flowering for about 4 years now. I top them up a little bit each year, but mostly leave them to do their own thing. We've had a really wet year though, and just as the display was about to look its best, it was completely annihilated with heavy rain. They're really delicate flowers, and if the weather doesn't cooperate, they kind of just turn into a mush. So after a few days of lovely looking crocuses, the lawn went back to grey and very boggy indeed. So not the best year for crocuses, but we did enjoy what we managed to see. Something that caused us quite a lot of stress in spring was our flock of ducks, and we've kept the ducks for a few years now. Mostly they don't cause us any problems, but this year it was like we were cursed. So we started the year with a flock of 4, and I think 3 out of 4 became quite ill and needed to go to the vets. So we had Waylon, Abby, Coco and Marnie. Abby was the only one that was thriving, she was in her element, but Waylon and Coco got attacked by rats and their wounds got infected, so that was quite nasty. And the regime for looking after them was quite labour intensive, so we had to bandage their feet where the wounds were, dress them with antiseptic, and we treated them with antibiotics twice a day and painkillers. And ducks don't really like having medicine through a syringe, so it was a lot of work. We also gave them warm salt baths in the house, which the dogs were not the most pleased with, so there was a lot of toing and froing, remembering to give them medication, packing their legs up, keeping them separate and dry, and it was a lot of time and a lot of money. But thankfully they both managed to recover, which was really amazing. We were quite worried about them and weren't sure whether they would make it. Unfortunately, our third poorly duck, Marnie, didn't survive. She had a different injury, and it was an internal injury. When we noticed that she was in pain, we rushed her to the vets and they had to put her to sleep straight away. It was really sad because she was a duck that I'd raised on the dining room table from an egg, and she imprinted on me quite well. She used to sit on my shoulder when she was really tiny, and then as an adult, if I was sunbathing outside, she'd curl up next to me and rest her head on my stomach. So it was really sad to say goodbye to Marnie, but needed to be done. We couldn't really keep her with that much pain and suffering. When we moved into April, it was really an amazing time in the garden, and I was feeling so pleased with all of the efforts that we'd put in the year before. So one area that I concentrated a lot of effort in was my mini meadow, which is an area just in front of me. And if you watch the videos in spring, you'll remember that this was full of snake's head fritillaries and daffodils, some naturalised primroses as well, and it looked absolutely stunning. I was so pleased with it. And it was something that I was resting a lot of hope on because I wanted to photograph it for the book. So you'll see in the book that we have some really lovely photos of the mini meadow flowering in sunset, and I was just delighted with that. It was perfect. I sectioned the meadow off with just some rough willow fencing, and the idea of that was to keep the ducks off it because I didn't want them to trample the bulbs. Didn't really work as planned, and it actually trapped the ducks in there and they squashed a lot of it, so that was a shame, but it bounced back quite quickly after I realised what was happening. The bulbs that I had added to the space I think were probably about 1,500. So I added Snowdrop Waranawi to flower at the start of the year, and then snake's head fritillaries in purple and white. I added Narcissus Pueblo, which is the lovely creamy daffodil that's in there, and I added some woodland anemones as well, but I don't think I had any success from those. There was a little bit of foliage, so we might see some more next spring. But I was really pleased with it, and I'm going to leave it well alone. Now the test is to see whether it will naturalise and flower again next year, see what survives. I think the ultimate test is whether or not it gets dug up by the squirrels and badgers, because that can happen to our bulbs. So keep your fingers crossed and you might see the same or better or worse next spring. The rest of the garden really started to come back to life around the mini meadow in April, so we had some beautiful blossoms on the fruit trees that line the garden. We had tulips popping up, some lovely double petaled tulips in my cutting patch, and a beautiful Clematis montana in flower that covers the wall on our wash house. I think those final weeks of spring in May are probably one of my favourite times in the garden. We leave some areas to grow long so that the insects can enjoy them. I particularly enjoyed watching the mini meadow as the snake's head fritillaries went to seed, and they were so stunning. They were really, really long, thin stems with a beautiful seed head on top that later exploded and spread seeds all over the grass, hopefully to continue growing snake's head fritillaries. I was really pleased with the progress in our flower borders. In past years, I've always felt a little bit embarrassed about how gappy these are in spring, but things are really starting to get established now that we're in our 5th year of gardening. We had a lovely understory of forget-me-nots that self-seed around as usual, and I can see them coming back ready for next spring already. We had some beautiful Linaria flowering and some gorgeous purple irises, which had spread enough for me to divide for the first time this year. I remember picking those up 5 years ago and planting them in the ground and thinking that I had to have a lot of delayed gratification to see them flowering in a couple of years' time. But now there's so many of them, I have been moving them around the garden and dividing them up to make new plants. So I'm really, really pleased with that. Excitingly, in spring, we also appeared on a few episodes of Alan Titchmarsh's Gardening Club. So that was really, really fun and we enjoyed that a lot. A massive job that we had some help with in spring was to start our new yew hedge, and we had areas of the garden that had become really, really overgrown, and we had some self-seeded trees in there that had started to get quite big, including an ash tree. So we did call in help to clear that area and get those self-seeded trees taken out before we planted an English yew hedge. An English yew is a native hedge, it's evergreen and it will benefit a lot of the local wildlife. So that's partly the reason for planting it, but it's just a hedge that I really, really like. I'm looking forward to trimming it, probably in some interesting wavy shapes as it grows into its space. So the landscapers started planting the hedge on one side of the garden, and I felt so inspired after watching them do it that I thought I would mirror the hedge on the other side, and I planted a further 18 hedges myself, but they were really heavy. They were almost 2 meters tall, and the root balls were about that big, so it took me a while to dig the holes, clear the space and carry them up the garden. So I was working on that for a few months, but it was something that I was really, really relieved to finally get done, and it's going to look much nicer than the wooden fences that we had in place before. Spring came to a close with some lovely garden harvests though, and one of my favourite things to harvest is asparagus, which was the first thing we planted when we moved in because we knew it would take a few years to get established, and now every spring it rewards us with a really lovely harvest. So we had asparagus, we had chard, lots of kale, some really good herbs this year. We had parsley and dill, lots of broad beans because they managed to overwinter without being eaten by mice, which is quite unusual. So that was really, really rewarding. That brings spring to a close though, and then we move into summer, which for us is June, July and August. If you're also a gardener based in the UK, you'll probably describe your summer in the same way as us. It was very, very wet and there were slugs absolutely everywhere. And I know for a lot of gardeners, these caused quite a lot of problems. So for us, we rely mostly on the ducks as slug control. They love eating them and they're really good at foraging for them. So we let them free range while we're out here and they help us keep on top of the slug populations. And if we were coming out here in the evening in the summer with a head torch, the ground was absolutely covered in them. I've never seen anything like it. So the ducks loved that. And in the time that they weren't free ranging, I was walking around with a bucket and putting slugs in the bucket and taking it to them as a treat. But we did find that just having 3 ducks wasn't quite enough. So we went to a local farm and chose a couple more, and we named them Patch and Dolly. And it was quite surprising to us how different their personalities were. So our original 3 ducks were bought from a show breeder. They're very orderly and neat, and they trot around the garden in a little line. Buying the 2 from a farm, it became apparent that they hadn't really seen people or man-made structures before. So when we added them to the garden, we found it quite sad to watch actually. They ran into the corner and hid under a hedge because they were so frightened. So it took a couple of weeks to get them really relaxed and used to the space. But after that, they settled in really well. And I'd say we reached kind of an equilibrium with the duck flock where our original 3 became a little bit more boisterous, and then the 2 that joined us calmed down a little bit, but they're still quite destructive and very, very loud. And we found that by increasing the size of the duck flock, it made it much easier to stay on top of the slug problem. And shortly after we bought the 2 new ducks. We made a video about them on TikTok and it ended up going viral. And we had a nice payment from this, so we thought we would treat the ducks to a new house as a thank you. So we called our friend round and he helped us build a lovely new enclosure for them, and he matched the style to our shed that he built for us as well. So we've got some lovely wooden arches on there, kind of looks a little bit like a church. And we were just really pleased with that. This summer I encountered some problems with the soil in my polytunnel, and summer is a time when I like to really focus on growing fruit and vegetables. I love growing tomatoes, but the soil in the polytunnel was maybe nutrient depleted at best and then completely hydrophobic in the worst damaged areas, and it was because I completely forgot to water it over winter. I think I was just so busy writing and working on things that I actually ended up neglecting the garden a little bit. So I learnt the hard way that you need to keep the soil moist enough through the winter, and I had to start a kind of regime to fix the soil while I was ready to get my tomatoes in. So the first thing I did, I don't normally like to dig my soil, but I dug 2 huge holes and I filled these with water, and eventually the hydrophobic soil started to absorb the water, and by the time it had drained I filled the hole with more water, and I repeated this for a day or 2 until the soil had no choice but to retain a decent amount of moisture. Then I looked to add some nutrients back, so I added a lovely thick mulch of homemade compost, most of which is made from the mess from the ducks, so that's really good and a good circular process to improve the soil. And while I was putting my tomatoes in, I cut up some comfrey leaves and put those underneath the base of the tomato plant in the hope that when the soil couldn't supply them with nutrients, maybe the comfrey leaves would biodegrade and get some nutrients in there. As a kind of head start for the tomatoes. And I think it worked. I was a bit worried, but as summer progressed, the plants in the polytunnel were really good. We had loads of tomatoes, lovely cucumbers, the herbs were amazing. The deep-rooted taproot kind of plants did especially well, I think, because the soil wasn't in the best condition towards the top, but they had a really nice thick deep root. So we had some lovely parsley and some lovely dill, but I was really pleased with how quickly we were able to transform the soil and start growing again. I also added an irrigation system to the polytunnel, so it automatically waters itself now and I don't need to remember to keep on top of it. And that's been a really big help for me, because I think the garden is slightly too big for me to remember to do everything myself, and if I can take the edge off in any places, it makes a massive difference. From our younger fruit trees around the garden, we picked cherries and peaches, and then from the more established trees we had some really amazing figs as well. The fig tree wasn't too bothered by the bad weather this year and it really thrived, so that was beautiful. In the borders we enjoyed summer flowers including foxgloves, linaria, roses, geraniums, and the clematis looked really lovely as well. We grow a few varieties of summer flowering clematis. One particular variety that we grow is Blue Angel, and it looked really good this year. It didn't mind the bad weather, which was surprising because the flowers are paper thin and very delicate, but I think it can produce so many flowers so reliably that even if one batch of flowers gets battered, it will be flowering again the next day. And it did so well that when we had the publishers round to shoot photos for the book cover, they chose that as the location for shooting the cover. Wildlife activity in the garden this summer was mixed though, and one thing that really stood out as being quite alarming was the lack of butterflies. There were a few weeks when it seemed like there weren't any pollinators at all, and it later picked up with things like bees, but the butterflies weren't anywhere to be seen, which was really unusual and quite scary. And we've got plants like buddleia that are normally covered in butterflies, and we just saw 1 or 2, and that's even including the cabbage white butterflies, which normally are a massive problem for people who grow cabbages and kales uncovered, but they just weren't this year, and so that was quite alarming. We did, however, find that we had a lot of moths around the garden, and that was quite reassuring. We had lots of scarlet tiger moths, cinnabar moths and vapora moths, and then a few hummingbird hawk moths as well, which was really lovely. And I know that this moth population is really helpful for the bats that live around the garden as well. And in summer we really enjoy sitting out here as the sun goes down and watching the bats fly around. I did quite a bit of planting in the summer, which I know isn't always the best time, but I think because the soil was so damp there wasn't really a risk that the plants were going to dry out while they were trying to get established. So I added a lot of new hostas, which a relative gave me as they were having a clear out in their garden, and they were particularly useful because we've got quite a lot of shady areas where other plants that I'd like to grow will just refuse. So now we've got a really lovely collection of hostas, and I can't wait to see these grow over the next few years. Summer came to a close with some really lovely harvests. Again, these weren't the biggest harvests, I think because of the weather being strange and because of the slugs being slightly a problem, but we had some beautiful tomatoes. The most prolific variety this year was yellow pear drop, and thankfully my favourite meal is pasta in tomato sauce, so I made loads of jars of tomato sauce for us this year, and that was great. Again, the herbs did really well: dill, parsley, French beans, climbing beans, cucumbers. I made, every year I make enough pickles for Aaron to have in his sandwiches throughout the year, so that was another thing that I managed to achieve just from the polytunnel, from a few plants. We also had courgettes, apples, and then some lovely dahlias for decoration as well. And then we move into autumn, which is September, October and November. The first thing that happened in autumn was the ducks molted quite early compared to usual. They looked really quite messy as they shed their old feathers and attempt to grow new ones. They just look very scraggly, they get quite tired and they stop laying. But the unusual thing for us was they didn't start laying again, and they haven't started laying again since, so they've had quite a big break this year. So let me know if you also keep ducks, if you've noticed a similar pattern, but it's definitely unusual for us. We tend to have at least one or two laying through the winter, but not this year. One thing that I'd worked on in the months and even year before autumn was to try and build up a collection of autumn flowering perennials. So things like asters, Japanese anemones, perennial sunflowers, echinacea and rudbeckia. And so I added lots of plants from a local grower, and I bought them from, he sort of runs a nursery out of his garden in the next village along, and you could tell that this meant they were really, really adapted for the local area. And even though they were tiny when I planted them in spring, probably about 9-10 centimetre pots, they'd settled into really, really healthy plants by the time autumn came around. So I really enjoyed the displays of flowers through the autumn, and I was quite pleasantly surprised with how many we actually had. Lots of the rudbeckia that was flowering this year was rudbeckia that I had grown from seed a couple of years ago, and I think it's another one of those delayed gratification things. You kind of sow the seeds, put them away, nurture them a little bit, but you can completely forget that they're actually going to become established plants one day, and then they always surprise you when it finally happens. In October I cleared out the polytunnel, and it had become completely riddled with blight. Absolutely no surprise, because we had really, really damp, wet weather, lots of humidity this year. So I was actually surprised that we managed to keep things going until October, and I did my best to leave the plants in as long as I could. If I started noticing signs of blight, I would cut those off and try and nourish the rest of the plant and keep them going. So we did get a really good amount of tomatoes through doing that, but by October it was just everywhere and it had to be cleared out. So I cut all the plants at the base, left the roots in to biodegrade within the soil and help nourish the soil structure. Cleared everything away, and I did plant some broad beans, but they got eaten by presumably mice within a few days, so no broad beans this spring I don't think, but it's always worth a try because I do love growing them over the winter. I'd say autumn is a time where I really struggle with feeling behind, I think because the days start to get shorter and then I give myself the task of planting so many hundreds or thousands of bulbs. If I don't get around to it, I can feel a little bit stressed, so that's something that I am going to actively work on, lowering my expectations and just enjoying the garden for what it is. When I ordered my bulbs, I think I ordered about 1,500, so it's a lot, but it's not as many as I usually do, which feels quite achievable. I managed to get half of them in, and I'm focusing my efforts on the new borders by the new yew hedges because the soil is kind of completely cleared. So I want to build up a stock of things that are going to reflower every year, including perennials and bulbs in front of the hedges themselves. The nice thing is we had some hellebores that started flowering even as early as November, so I have been building up a stock of different varieties, and if I find one that does flower really early, I will always add it to the garden. They feel like a really nice bridge between the two seasons and maintaining a little bit of joy as the garden moves into a kind of grey resting state, which is so important. So I really, really love those early flowering hellebores. We were also given another duck in the autumn. We've named her Wednesday, but she was formerly known as Jemima, and she was given to us by a viewer that couldn't look after her anymore. And she was really, really tame when we picked her up. She integrated into the flock so easily. We were really surprised. Normally ducks don't like having new ducks join the flock, so you have to put a barrier between the two parties and have them stare at each other for about a week until you can finally integrate them. But she was very relaxed and they all got on really easily, so that made our jobs easier too. And now we've got a flock of 6, which is amazing. And that brings us into winter, which is December, January and February, and the current season. So now that we're into December, I'm halfway through bulb planting. I think I've got around 600 left to go. I just need a nice few days that are warm enough, and I'm sure it will be fine. I'll get through it quite quickly. I'm doing a little bit of tidying up, not so much cutting back plants because I like to leave them in place for overwintering insects. The same with the leaves, as you'll see around the borders. I like to leave those on the soil, and the soil is looking amazing under there. I was really, really grateful for the leaf mulch that it's getting every year. But I am tidying the leaves off the lawn, picking up the sticks that have been brought down by the storm, and just generally trying to keep some areas neat while the others look a bit messier, so that I feel quite pleased overall. But looking back at the winter months at the beginning of this year, so we know what we've got coming up, I introduced probably about 18 new varieties of hellebore. Most of these I bought from Ashwood Nurseries, which is a hellebore specialist, and they have some really gorgeous varieties. I highly recommend them. They have a group of hellebores called the Evolution Group, and these come in stunning neon colours, lots of sunset and pastel colours as well, so I added lots of those to the garden, and those really are my favourite thing to look forward to in February. So I think we've probably got just over 30 hellebores in the garden now, and I think it's just going to be something that I top up every winter. I really, really love them, and we've got quite a few areas that are suited to them in partial shade or shaded by deciduous trees, so I can't wait to see those again this winter. I'm also working on establishing some groups of snowdrops around the garden, and we see these flowering in winter. So I've got some in the grass and then some around the borders, and I've been doing this partly by dividing plants that were here already, partly by adding bulbs in autumn, and then also by adding plants around February time, which is known as adding them in the green. And I think I started this 2 or 3 years ago, but I'm already really pleased with how many there are and how quickly they're dividing under the ground and spreading. It's going to take quite a long time for them to make a really big impact, but I don't mind at all. I'm still pleased to see them when there are a few of them in flower. Winter is also when I like to order willow from a local farm to do weaving with. So at the start of the year, I ordered some from the farm and I made hurdles with it. And it took me a while to get round to actually making the hurdles, partly because I had to coppice trees to make the stakes with, but I got there eventually and I'm really, really happy with them. I think they add a nice little accent to the borders and give something interesting to look at in winter when there's not much else going on. So I'm going to do the same thing again this year, but this time I will be focusing my efforts closer to the house. It was something that was really easy, I really enjoyed it, and I find a simple repetitive task like that is one of the best things for switching off a busy brain. And one of the last things I'll be doing in winter is reordering my seeds. I need to start again completely because I had my seeds really nicely organised in drawers in the shed month by month, and then some rats moved in and stole every single packet and pulled them down a hole. So I'm completely out of seeds and need to start again. I think one of my friends is going to share her supply with me, which is really, really kind and a lovely reminder of what gardening is about. We didn't spend an awful amount of time in the garden through December because we were busy having some work done on the house, and it was really, really disruptive. to our routines, but thankfully now we have a lovely cosy house to get us through the colder months. So we had double glazing, we had solar panels installed, roof insulation, ventilation to help with the breathability of the house, and it's so much more comfortable now. It really, really was worth it, and I would happily sacrifice a few weeks in the garden to get all of that work done. And that more or less concludes the year in the garden. Now our aims going forward, we're going to keep making monthly garden tours for you, so please do subscribe if you'd like to see those. And I can't wait to show you the spring bulbs as usual. I'm going to really, really try hard in this upcoming year to avoid that feeling of being perpetually behind, and just admit to myself that my pace is okay, and if I have a year where I don't get much done at all, it's completely fine. The garden will still do its own thing and be rewarding. Thank you so much for watching this video, particularly if you've made it this far, and we can't wait to welcome you back to the garden next year.